Good afternoon. My name is Philip McDonough. I'm a member of the board of the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, and it's my honour and privilege to introduce the next keynote speaker, Tim O'Connor. Now, he may, for a lot of us, he needs no introduction. He knows us, many of us, very well, and we know him. I think the first time I met Tim was, I think it was probably back in 2001 when my firm was appointed to in the euphoria and aftermath of the Good Friday Agreement almost. It was, things were still very positive, and my firm was appointed to undertake a study called the Obstacles to Cross-Border Mobility, looking at all sorts of things like phones and insurance and banking and tax systems and all that. And when we went for our first steering group meeting for the start of the study, one of the members of the steering group said to us, and he was an advisor to the First Minister, Mr. Trimble at the time, and a well-known English economist, said to me, well, you know, this study is just about identifying the obstacles. You don't have to give any answers. Just identify the obstacles and tell us what those are. We don't really want to know. Now, tell a consultant to not come up with any recommendations was the wrong thing to say. But the person in the steering group who was particularly helpful to us, along with his counterpart, the Northern Joint Secretary of the NSMC, was Tim, who was very supportive to us throughout that study. I'll never forget that support that he gave us. Tim comes from as you can see from his biography, he's a diplomat first and foremost. Comes from a long line of diplomats who've emerged in Ireland, and Tim has certainly got all the diplomatic skills, articulate. He's very persuasive and also very charming. But most importantly in his biography, you'll see that he was very intimately concerned with the negotiations around the Good Friday Agreement. So I think we're all looking forward to hearing what he has to say, reflecting 25 years back on his own experience. So thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Philip. As the saying goes, I didn't expect you to read out everything I gave you, but yeah. Thank you. A great man. I really enjoyed working greatly with you too, Philip. So thank you, and great to be back with you. So this is, I'm very conscious, the afternoon. It's been a long day, and there's coffee coming up. And but anyway, this is the slot that Anthony gave me. It's a great honor to be here. It's a fantastic occasion. And I just want to, I'm sure, echo all of us sitting here, how brilliant the panelists have been so far, the last one, the first one this morning, and of course, extraordinary contribution of Colin Davidson. And I suppose, as a diplomat, you know, I've always recognized the power of the artist, and it's always difficult following in the artist. So I suppose my line could be, you know, this morning you had the uplifting insights of the artist, and my job is to lower the tone and bring you the civil servant's perspective, you know. But anyway, that's us. And so I suppose Anthony is very persuasive, and he asked me to sort of join here today. And I want to give a shout out to the CCBS first of all, because, you know, 25 years on almost, fantastic work that you do, bringing people together across the island like you've done here today. And a shout out also to Andy Pollock, who's, I know he's not here, but good friend, who was the founding CEO, and Ruth is here as well, and all the great people over the years who've continued, and today in very good hands of Anthony and the board and the team here. So I'm a real honour to be connected with the centre. We did a deal, Anthony and myself. I said, I'd do this because I'm retired. I'm off the pitch now, and David Sterling is down there. We're off the pitch, David, but we're still around somewhere in the vicinity. But I said, the condition was that it would be a personal take. I don't represent anybody. I'm not an academic. I'm not a historian. So this is not an academic or a historian's. I'm a retired civil servant who happened to be on the pitch, as Philip says, you know, 25 years ago, at a particular inflection point in North-South relations. And I thought it would be, this was a moment in the 25th anniversary year to have the chance to shine a light on this aspect of the agreement, the North-South aspect of the agreement. And I was taken with Brona this morning talking about, the opportunity to put a focus on the community and voluntary sector, which I fully agree with what you said on that. And I suppose in a way, I'm trying to do the same here, that on the North-South aspect particularly. So I suppose this is kind of like what I saw and what I heard and what I did. And there's two other kind of caveats that I just want to mention, because again, we're coming towards the end of the 25th anniversary year. I do want to give a few shout outs to people, not the politicians actually, because I think quite rightly the politicians have been honoured this year, and as a civil servant I saw up close the extraordinary work done by the political leaders. I wanted to give a shout out to my own creed, the civil servants and the backroom people. As I go along, I'm going to do that. It's always a bit dangerous naming names, but again, I'm going to take the risk there. And I want to give the shout outs. And I suppose occasionally as well I'd be throwing in a bit of stuff about my own role as I went along. Might sound a little bit self-indulgent, but as the old song goes, it's my party and I'll cry if I want to. But so there we go. So I suppose a quick personal one where we started. And by the way, if this is, I'm talking now really about 25 years ago, so any of you that are not, they're not particularly interested, why are we going back talking about 25 years ago? I'd say the next half an hour, you might maybe want to go out and have a cup of coffee and we can come back in again. But here we go. So I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs, the famous DFA, in 1979. And I give a shout out to several colleagues from DFA today here. Great to be back among you. And that's the entry grade for the civil service, third secretary. So after various initial postings, my first posting was in the Irish Embassy in Germany 4 years. And I was assigned then in 1986, when I came back from Bonn, I was assigned to my next job, and they said Northern Ireland Division. And so, and that was my first time being involved. I was based in Ivy House in the, what was called then the Anglo-Irish Division of the department. That's what they called it in those days. And as my career kind of moved forward over the next 25 years, I was to serve in that division 3 times in all, and a couple of times when also when I was Consul General in New York, and also when I was Secretary General to President McAleese, of course, the Northern Ireland question. So the issue has been with me since 1986, and I admit I am utterly obsessed. So I suppose I joined the department, joined the Anglo-Irish Division in the summer of 1986 when the Troubles were in full flow. It was 17 years, more or less, since the outbreak in '69, and the toll of death, injury and destruction, was continuing relentlessly. But the winds of change were beginning to blow. The Anglo-Irish Agreement of November '85 had instituted a sea change in the relationships between the British and Irish governments. And for the first time since the establishment of the Irish state and Northern Ireland in the early 1920s, the Irish government had a consultative role in the running of Northern Ireland. And where was North-South cooperation as an issue in all of this? Answer: deeply divisive and contested. Ever since that creation of a border on the island of Ireland in the early 1920s, the concept of cooperation across it had been a key part of the overall contestation between unionism and nationalism on the island of Ireland. I'm simplifying here, but broadly speaking, for unionism, the issue was seen as a slippery slope to a united Ireland, a Trojan horse, and a threat to Northern Ireland's status as an integral part of the United Kingdom. And for nationalism, an absolutely legitimate and necessary exercise, both in practical terms and as a recognition of its Irish identity. For the 50 years from 1922 to the proroguing of Stormont in 1972, cooperation between the two jurisdictions, therefore, had practically been non-existent. That's an overstatement, but broadly speaking, true. And how did that shift? My good friend Pat Hines of the Glencree Reconciliation Centre, and I call him a kind of a guru of the minutiae of war and peace in Ireland, and he's here today, I think, is of the view that the first inkling of an acceptance by the British government of there being an Irish dimension to the Northern Ireland question came in the Green Paper published by the Northern Ireland Office, the NIO, in October 1972, called The Future of Northern Ireland. It's for any of the nerds among us, it's a paper worth looking at, which I did preparing for this. Since from the Irish government's perspective, an Irish dimension to Northern Ireland had to include meaningful North-South engagement, one could argue that from that moment in late 1972 onwards, the principle of cross-border cooperation took on a new status doctrinally, at least between the two governments. And by the way, I use the phrases cross-border and north-south interchangeably in what I'm saying here. But it would be another 26 years after 1972 before that principle could be given actual and substantial expression in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Quite simply, that was because the issue was tied up with the overall conflict, and North-South could only be resolved in the context of a wider overall settlement. At the same time, it is important to note that the various initiatives undertaken by the two governments over that 26-year period in terms of developing a shared approach to North-South cooperation did play a significant role in shaping what was eventually agreed on the issue in 1998. In other words, we weren't starting with a blank sheet at the start of the negotiations that led to the agreement. I'm talking here about the Sunningdale Agreement in 1973 with its Council of Ireland concept, the joint studies on North-South cooperation instituted by the two governments as a result of an Anglo-Irish summit in December 1980, Charlie Haughey and Margaret Thatcher, the Anglo-Irish Agreement itself in 1985, and the framework document agreed between the two governments in February 1995, which I'll come back to again in a few moments. While these initiatives did not in themselves lead to breakthroughs in North-South, they were very important building blocks in terms of the eventual outcome achieved in 1998. So that was the situation at intergovernmental level. It's only fair to record in the setting of this conference, and I suppose in terms of the very good panels we've been hearing throughout the day, that throughout the lean years and the decades I'm talking about, many activities did take place across the border at non-governmental, at civil society level. Clearly in the sporting field, for instance, organisations involved with the GAA, rugby, cricket, hockey, golf, boxing, to name but a few, bravely ensured that their sport was all Ireland on the basis that they were all the richer for that, and that was what those sports always did. And I know David has been involved heavily in golf, and I was involved with bringing together the new integrated male and female Golf Ireland, and talking to some of my northern counterparts in the golfing world, why in 1922, golf didn't partition, and the answer was because this is what we always do. So certain individuals deserve great credit also for walking against the wind and the hill in promoting North-South relations in economic terms and seeing their value and importance. I'm thinking in particular of Sir George Quigley, a great friend of this institution, who in many ways is the father figure of the concept of the island economy, a term he coined in the early 1990s when it was neither profitable nor popular. And on one of our panels today is Michael Darcy, another good friend who's down at the back there. And Michael deserves a tip of the hat as well for a seminal publication he co-edited in 1995 called Border Crossings. I'm sure Michael has copies available there for you. Seeking to capture the potential of peace for the advancement of prosperity for the island as a whole, a cause he continues to champion to great effect today in his work with Danny McCoy and IBEC, exemplified in their very impressive campaign to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement called For Peace and Prosperity, demonstrating the inextricable linkage between the two, and I know we'll be hearing more about that later. But again, work like George and Sir George and Michael's work were very important, those kinds of initiatives. But overall, as I say, kind of lean pickings, and that was the overall situation then as the talks ramped up in the autumn of 1997 that were eventually to lead in the following April to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Another quick personal entry here, just by this stage in October 1997, I don't know where you were there at that point, Bruno, you were in the middle of getting ready for the talks. I was back working in the Anglo-Irish division in DFA, having been away from it for a period. I'd been director of the Human Rights Unit, and I was assigned to the Irish government delegation in the negotiations under the leadership of Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. Any mention of Bertie Ahern, and I am mentioning politicians here, and any mention of Bertie Ahern and Good Friday must be quickly followed by a reference to his political brother, Tony Blair. I did say most of my focus will be on civil servants, but I do feel I have to make an exception with these two principles, because in truth, based on my vantage point as a civil servant inside the tent, these two leaders played extraordinary roles in terms of the outcome of the Good Friday Agreement and the achievement of peace. And I feel I have to say that here today. While I'm on names, there's one other person right now that I want to mention, and it's an official level, and it was my boss during this entire period of my career, Dermot Gallagher, the legendary head of the Anglo-Irish Division of the Department of Foreign Affairs at the time of Good Friday, and subsequently a distinguished Secretary General of DFA. Dermot is now sadly deceased, but I can honestly say that any record of any account of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement that doesn't include the significance of his contribution isn't a true and accurate record. And I'm sure anybody here from the department, Rory de Burca in Dublin and Lauren Sims and others today, the current holders, I think, would agree with that. But back to the wider scene in the autumn of 97, talks had been underway since the summer of 96, chaired by another hero of the process, Senator George Mitchell, ably supported by his co-chairs, General John de Chastelain and Harry Holkery. But the backdrop was unfavourable. The politics remained deeply divided, and critically, the resumed IRA campaign was still underway, so Sinn Féin was not at the table. The dynamic shifted significantly in the summer of 97 with the election of new governments in London and Dublin with new mandates, and the IRA ceasefire was restored in July. The multi-party talks resumed in the autumn with Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern leading their delegations and Sinn Féin at the table. Negotiations were now well and truly up and running. By the way, if you want a comprehensive account of the talks themselves as a whole, I recommend two publications, a book by a former colleague, David Donoghue, called One Good Day, and also Bertie Ahern's podcast that he did with News Talk earlier in the year called The Good Friday Agreement, as I remember it. As the negotiations got underway that autumn, the difficulties around North-South made their presence felt from the outset. So anybody interested in North-South today, what was it like as an issue? And Brona was there, right, and others too, at the beginning of the negotiations. And in many ways, it was hugely, I would say, neuralgic. I suppose, and for a long time we were stuck on it. Everybody was cagey about showing their hand until they thought that endgame was in sight. Everybody paid lip service to the concept that something meaningful would have to happen in North-South, but everybody had wildly different views about what that would mean in actuality. For the two governments, a new blueprint in that regard had already been set. It was an initiative I mentioned a few moments ago, that the so-called framework document of February 1995. Not exactly a bestseller out there, I agree, but nonetheless a key document in my view. It was an agreed text between the two governments at the time, led by John Major and John Bruton. So in other words, two different governments to the ones that were in play by the late 97. In effect, it constituted a shared understanding between the two governments on what the issues were that would need to be addressed and resolved in any comprehensive talks process. In my view, it's a pivotal foundation document for what happened later in 1998, and I tip the hat to the two senior officials leading its drafting, Sean O'Higgin in DFA and Quentin Thomas in the NIO. I kind of see the framework document as a kind of X-ray of the agreement and a kind of what lies beneath. On North-South, the framework document made clear the dialectic between the wider constitutional and political questions on the one hand and cross-border cooperation on the other. The two sets of factors were inextricably intertwined, and it set out an elaborate template of what the architecture of the North-South framework should look like. After a difficult Christmas 97 break in which there were indications of violence ramping up again, the two governments tabled to the parties a heads of agreement in January 1998. This was a one-pager, in a sense, a dramatic condensing of the framework document, and it set out their view on what the elements in an agreement would be. North-South figured prominently. The two governments proposed there would be a North-South Ministerial Council to bring together those with executive responsibility in Northern Ireland and the Irish government in particular areas. All decisions would be by agreement between North and South, and implementation bodies would be established to execute policies agreed by the Council to operate in meaningful areas and at an all-island level. But of course, this was all bare bones stuff, no detail, and the heavy lifting still remained to be done. Nonetheless, the Heads of Agreement document did serve the purpose of concentrating minds, and in effect, it turned out to be an important signposting to what would eventually emerge. That said, the going continued to be tough and slow. By March, even the saintly George Mitchell had run out of patience. And I'm sure you remember this moment, Brona. In a dramatic moment on the 20th of March, he called all of us delegates together. I won't ever forget it anyway. And he said to declare a deadline for the ending of the talks. Thursday, the 10th of April, which was less than 3 weeks away. Now, can you imagine, after 800 years of history, 400 years, 100 years, we now have about 2.5 weeks more or less, give or take, to sort it out. I mean, the shock, I cannot convey to you. You remember, Brona, the shock that was in that room. Well, I suppose, well, certainly we didn't see home much, shall we say, for the few weeks after that. And the intensity wrapped up big time because, one thing about George Mitchell, he's a diplomat as well, Philip, but when he says, he's also a judge, so when he speaks, he ain't kidding. And so the pace comes up and North-South now comes to the fore. So now the time had come to stop circling around the question and begin to sketch in the detail. And everybody knew this was going to be hugely difficult. The historic standoff on the various positions remained totally intact. Inside the Irish government delegation, we were working hard in drafting up scenarios which would pass the double test on North-South, be ambitious enough from an Irish government nationalist perspective, while at the same time not frightening the life out of the Unionists. As somebody holding a number of pens, I can tell you a lot easier said than done. As George's deadline, which as I mentioned he'd formally set for Thursday the 9th of April, approached, the pace ramped up a few more notches. In effect, it fell to the two governments to agree a first draft of the North-South arrangements, which could be given to George for inclusion in his draft of an overall possible agreement. George had hoped to issue such a first draft of an agreement by the Friday before his deadline, but that proved impossible, primarily because the work on the North-South was not yet complete. We worked intensively with our British counterparts over the weekend, and by Monday, the 6th of April, we had a comprehensive draft of the North-South section ready to give to George Mitchell. In truth, it was at the ambitious end. The case to our British colleagues was that the framework document in 1995, which they had agreed, had to be the basis for the design of the North-South section of the agreement. This involved cross-border bodies with significant powers in significant areas. In addition, the Irish government were insisting that these bodies had to be founded in the first instance on Westminster and Dáil and Shannon Éireann legislation because of the fear that if their establishment was in the gift of the Assembly only, they might never happen. In addition, the North-South section included a number of appendices containing in all a large set of areas where new cross-border arrangements could apply over time. All challenging stuff and the subject of a huge amount of work by a lot of people throughout that time. So this is a moment now where I'm going to give a few shout-outs, so bear with me, but I do feel strongly about it. So I've already mentioned these people working on all of this. Now, I've mentioned Dermot Gallagher, the Lord have mercy on him. And I add to that roll of honour on the Irish side officials such as Paddy Tehan, Tim Dalton, Martin Mansur, David Donoghue, Wally Kerwin, David Cooney, Joe Lennon, Jim Hamilton, Kathleen Neal-Laherty, Rory Montgomery, Ray Bassett, Eamon McKee, Ken O'Leary, Paul Hickey and Jerry Staunton. And on the British side, Jonathan Powell, John Holmes, Quentin Thomas, Bill Jeffrey, Jonathan Stevens, Alistair Campbell, George Ferguson, David Hill, David Lavery, and Alan Weisel, whom I think I saw here today earlier. Alan was right in the middle of all of that. There was a host of others, of course, and I'm immediately in trouble, but trust me, each of those people played key roles in those hectic days and nights. Can I take the liberty of particularly singling out one other politician, Seamus Mallon? One of the privileges of a career is that frequently professional colleagues can become personal friends, and that's what happened for me with Seamus. As well as being an exceptional political leader, he was an enormously warm and compassionate human being, and our friendship is something that I will always treasure. Some of you will know that I had the honour, at his prior request and that of his dear daughter Orla, to give the eulogy at his funeral in January 2020. So you can imagine, if that's where we were in our friendship, what it meant to me, and I still miss him. And can I say to you that his partnership with John Hume, another giant of the peace process, and now also sadly gone, was one of enormous importance to the establishment of peace in Ireland, and we owe them both and a huge debt of gratitude. But back to George Mitchell's ticking clock. As I mentioned, by the Monday, the 6th of April, with George's deadline now 3 days away, the Irish and British governments had finally reached agreement on the draft North-South section and had passed it to George for inclusion in his first draft of the agreement. We came to call that overall document Mitchell 1, if you remember, Brona. That document was called Mitchell 1. So it's a first draft issued late on the Monday night to all of the delegations. I think it's well recorded what happened next. When they saw the scale of what was being proposed on North-South, the UUP side erupted. John Taylor announced publicly that he wouldn't touch the document with a 40-foot barge pole. The phrase, "that went well, I thought," comes to mind. And then, on a sadder note, to compound matters, Bertie Ahern was encountering personal tragedy. His beloved mother, Julia, died on that Monday morning. So can you imagine the mangling of emotions that were going on for Bertie as he now juggles the personal trauma of losing his mother and the most important negotiations of his political life. It's well documented that at the removals of his mother's remains on Tuesday night, the 7th of April, down in Dublin, he took a call from Paddy Teahan, his Secretary General at the Department of the Taoiseach, who briefed him on the scale of the crisis affecting the talks as a result of Unionist reaction to the North-South proposals put forward by the two governments in Mitchell 1. Walking on his own along Griffith Avenue in Dublin as he took that call, Bertie Ahern sought to digest what Paddy Teahan was telling him and the huge decisions he would now have to make if the talks were to be saved. In effect, he had to calculate how far he could calibrate back from the ambitious North-South arrangements agreed with London the previous weekend in order to address Unionist concerns, while at the same time somehow keeping the SDLP and Sinn Féin at the table as well, and of course meeting our own needs from an Irish government perspective. He authorised Paddy Teahan to return to David Trimble and indicate his willingness to reduce the scale of ambition in regard to North-South while keeping the essentials of the original proposals in play. This had the effect of giving David Trimble some political elbow room with his own party and negotiating team during the very fractious meetings around the proposals. I mentioned previously the deep connection of North-South to the constitutional question, and in particular the changes the Irish government was prepared to make to the Irish constitution, essentially dropping the territorial claim in Northern Ireland and replacing it with the principle of consent. A big question David Trimble now had was that if there were going to be a dilution of the North-South arrangements, whether Bertie Ahern would still agree to the proposed changes to the Irish constitution, given that the two issues were so interlinked. In other words, if there was a change in the quid, would there be a change in the quo? Bertie Ahern chose to tell David Trimble directly that he would stick to his arrangements in regard to the Constitution, the changes in the Irish Constitution, but his condition was that David Trimble remain on in the talks till the deal was done. That turned out to be a breakthrough moment in the whole process and the key reason why, when the heat came on big time on Good Friday itself, David Trimble stood by his agreement with Bertie Ahern and signed up to the deal. When Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair resumed their discussions on the Wednesday, remember one day before George's deadline, the key focus was seeking to put flesh on the bones of what a revised and scaled-back North-South section would look like. Led by Dermot Gallagher and Paddy Teahan, on our side, we, the officials, worked intensively with our British counterparts and also in close discussions with, in particular, the UUP and the SDLP to come up with a new formula, and by Thursday evening, that had taken shape. In essence, what was agreed was that there would be an institution, the North-South Ministerial Council, and there would be cooperation between Belfast and Dublin within the Council on a range of matters that would fall into two baskets: areas where cooperation would be taken forward by existing institutions and areas where cooperation would be taken forward by new implementation bodies operating on a cross-border or all-island basis. The numbers in each case would be at least 6. Why 6? Because that's what the market would bear. That was a very significant rowing back on the scale of what was contained in Mitchell 1. And moreover, this was a big gamble. The identity and details of the bodies would be for a further process of negotiation after the main agreement was finalised. That work to be completed by no later than the 31st of October 1998, about 6 months away. So just think about it, folks, now. That was a big gamble. So the detail and the scope and scale was actually kicked down the road after the agreement was signed. While this was a big rollback, as I say, on the scale and scope of Mitchell 1, it had the key virtue that the unions could live with it, and from a nationalist and Irish government perspective, there was the prospect of getting the best deal possible in the subsequent negotiations in the autumn. That meant that by the Thursday evening, the basic shape of the North-South section of the agreement was now largely settled. There were a number of other key issues remaining unresolved, and we worked on those all through Thursday night and into Good Friday morning, and by dawn, the main lines of an agreement were in place. I'm not going to go into here the drama that followed during that day, Bro, and I'm sure it's still etched in your memory what that long day was like, when last-minute concerns were raised inside the UUP delegation And all I'll say is, thankfully, they got resolved. And as you all know, at about 5 p.m. on Good Friday, 10th of April, George Mitchell was able to announce to the world that the deal was done. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement was born. Of course, in many ways, while this was an ending, it was also just a beginning. Those further negotiations to work out the details on the cross-border arrangements, including the identity and scope of the North-South bodies, remain to be undertaken. That work began after the simultaneous historic referenda North and South on the 22nd of May 1998 signalled the approval of the people of the island of Ireland for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. In effect, this further North-South work was an intensive new process in its own right and was successfully completed in March 1999 with the signing of a supplementary international agreement between the two governments with the consent of the parties, establishing 6 new cross-border bodies: Waterways Ireland, Safe Food, Intertrade Ireland, the language body comprising Forest na Gaeilge and the Ulster Scots Agency, the Lochs Agency and the Special EU Programmes body. Tourism Ireland was to follow a year and a half or so later. The negotiation of that supplementary agreement establishing the North-South bodies was an important project for me personally, as Dermot Gallagher asked me to lead out on the DFA side on it, and together with my DFA colleagues Rory Montgomery and James McIntyre, and in close and collegial partnership with Wally Kerwin and his team in the Department of the Taoiseach, we worked intensively over that summer, autumn and winter on this critical project from an Irish government perspective. What was interesting about this exercise was that our main interlocutors on the British government side were increasingly drawn from the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Most of the officials negotiating the Good Friday Agreement itself were drawn from the UK Civil Service, the Prime Minister's Office, the NIO and the Foreign Office. But the engagement on the new North-South dispensation in that autumn-winter of 98 into 99 was largely handled by the Northern Ireland Civil Service under direction, of course, of the NIO, as the executive was not yet in place. Again, on a personal note, I'm taking the liberty to give a shout out to our main northern counterparts in this exercise: Tony McCusker, Rosalie Flanagan and Dennis McCartney, with important input by George Gray and Brenda King, today the Distinguished Attorney General of Northern Ireland. George Ferguson from the Foreign Office played an important liaison role also. Our relationship with Tony, Rosalie and their team was warm and collegiate in what was a complex and elaborate project. In effect, we were establishing the foundations for cross-border cooperation for the next generation. And a little personal story, I used to ring Tony at maybe 9 o'clock in the morning for a quick daily check-in. What I didn't realise was that he was taking his son Peter to school, and Peter was a mimic. And after 5 or 6 or 7 phone calls, this West Limerick guy calling his father every morning, so Peter developed a very good imitation of my Limerick accent. So that's just a little part of the McCusker family history from this time. I also want to add my thanks to the colleagues in the various departments, North and South, who made a huge contribution to the work of establishing the North-South bodies. It was they had the detail on the various policy areas, and we relied greatly on their expertise and cooperation. Now, I want to say something very strange. The 2 departments of finance were particularly helpful and supportive. I want to pause there because I'm from the Department of Finance and I'm here to help you. Well, actually, turns out for once, that's true. Well, we really needed them. You know, the establishment of the 6 cross-border bodies and subsequently Tourism Ireland had all sorts of ramifications from a financial, governance and staffing point of view, and the expertise and purse strings on this all rested with the 2 departments of finance. And they responded positively and constructively, recognising the historic nature of what was being designed. So again, I tip the hat this time to people like Phil Furlong, Kieran Connolly, Aidan Dunning, Michael Erity, Cormac Cronin, Tony Jordan and Seamus Dwyer in the Dublin Department of Finance, and in Belfast colleagues like David Sterling, today a proud member of the board of the CCBS, and he's chair, I think, of a later session. Andrew McCormack, Richard Pengelly, Gary Ewing, Jack Laborie, Leo O'Reilly and David Thompson. I'm probably leaving out some David there. And I see Dominic McCullough was down there earlier, I think, from today's. So Dominic, your predecessors did the business. All of these people played key roles behind the scenes in ensuring that the cross-border bodies were solidly constructed with a sound governance, budgetary and staffing foundation. While a great deal of the detailed work on the cross-border bodies and supplementary international agreement was negotiated, as I said, at official level between the two governments, there was also important input by the Northern Ireland parties and their backroom teams. And I think, every credit to all of the people involved there as well. While the North-South Bodies Agreement was finalised in March 1999 and enshrined in legislation in Westminster and the Dáil and Shannon Éireann, they could not yet be brought formally into being. That was because of the continued standoff during that period around the creation of the Executive and Assembly, pithily described as no guns, no government. George Mitchell had to be called back from New York in September 1999 to conduct a review of the agreement. That was successfully completed in mid-November of that year, and finally on the 2nd of December, all of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement came into being, including the North-South Ministerial Council and the North-South bodies. I'm coming now towards the final section, but I'm just, you can hear how much there is, and I'm trying to condense a huge amount of stuff into a short period of time, but before it all disappears into the mist, I thought it would be good just to try and capture, that's what happened. So what I'm just going to talk about in the remaining few minutes is what happened then, just a brief summary. So in the days, there was a personal thing for me then, so I have to admit, a beneficiary of this from a career point of view. In the days leading up to the 2nd of December 1999, Dermot Gallagher called me aside to tell me that I was going to be promoted to Assistant Secretary General and sent to Armagh to be the inaugural Southern Joint Secretary of the North-South Ministerial Council, already called the NSMC. So this is a huge moment for me personally, and I didn't see it coming, honestly, but there you are. So I'm very grateful to the Northern Ireland peace process. And a standout memory is getting into a car at the back of Ivy House on the morning of the 2nd of December with colleagues Martin O'Fannin, Almany Quigley and Andrew Harwood, setting off for the ecclesiastical capital to rendezvous with Derek Wheeler, the then lead official on the northern side of the Secretariat, to get our work underway. And by the way, the building that we chose to be our offices, which we had to all do at very much lastminute.com, was the Queen's University campus at the time in Armagh, based in the old infirmary. Some of our offices were in the old mortuary. Anyway, look, I'm just saying. And who was based down the corridor? Only Andy Pollock, who had just arrived a couple of months before that and set up shop there. And I went on then to spend the next 5.5 years in one of the old doctor's bedrooms, I'm told. It was a doctor. And that's the longest time I ever spent in one office in my whole career, but great memories. There's a further story, obviously, as I say, to be told about all of this, the establishment, the NSMC and the North-South bodies, but it really is a further story and worthy of a talk all by itself. And as well as the inter-administration level, that story would include the work of organisations like the CCBS, the ICLRD, the Joint Council of CBI IBEC, Universities Ireland, the 3 border networks, Pamela's here, and huge work was done across a whole range of areas, and Bronas in the community and voluntary sector, and a whole range of other great projects that have evolved from the new North-South dispensation heralded by the agreement. And of course the Institute of Public Health, which we'll be hearing about, a kind sponsor, they also stem from around this time and have been doing superb work. I'm just going to confine myself today to saying that it was a very exciting time, a pioneering time, and working with Philip and projects like that, it was fantastic. And I suppose at a personal level, whole new friendships, and a big shout out for me personally to the teams in Armagh and the Secretariat, both North and South. We knew we were doing very privileged work. We were really doing something that had never been done before. And the bonds between the two sides of the Secretariat and Armagh were very strong. We had people from North, South, East and West, Catholic, Protestant, GA, cricket, Orangemen, and so it was a phenomenal microcosm. And as well as saying a shout out to my southern colleagues at the time, I want to give a particular shout out to some of my northern counterparts. I was very lucky. Dick McKenzie was the first Northern Joint Secretary, and later Peter Smith, 2 great public servants, and their deputy, Pat Donaghy. And it was also fantastic to see the spirit of cooperation between the 2 civil service and within the cross-border bodies. And the initial acting chief executives of the cross-border bodies had a especially significant role, and I salute them and everybody involved. And I think that, so just I have 2 final comments for me. I said the focus of my talk was on the events of 25 years ago, but I do want to make two general observations as somebody who has left the pitch. And it seems to me that tremendous work continues to be done in North-South cooperation, and we're a long way ahead of where we were in 1998. I think the 6 cross-border bodies and their further addition in 2000 in the form of Tourism Ireland have all done and are doing exceptional work in their respective areas. And hats off to the CEOs and all the teams involved. And I know Gina McIntyre has been here today and Margaret Hearty, and I think we owe them a great debt. And I know there's a narrative out there that like this thing is stuck, and of course a lot more could be done, and there's no doubting that the political impasse is affecting the full realize. But that it would be wrong to say that in fact as a result of that there's nothing happening north. So that kind of does drive me mad. Actually, there's a huge amount of work going on by the bodies right across the board, and it's light years away ahead of where it was when we were starting out 25 years ago on a barren desert. So I think it's important to record that as well. And of course, much more potential as well. I also want to give a shout out to the current holders of the Joint Secretary posts in Armagh, and they're here today, Hilary Riley and also Richard Hill, and also Mark Hanafy, who just was Hilary's predecessor. Great work being done, guys. I know it's not easy, but you're doing a tremendous job in managing the complexities that you have to do, and I know that you'll continue to do that with great skill. I also think that the shared island, and we've heard about it today, I think it's doing very good work. It's long after my time, so I have no personal stake in it, but it just seems to me it's good, practical, pragmatic, focused work, and I think that's definitely part of the way forward. And that brings me then to my final point. You'll be very glad to hear. And this is a bit of something I just want to say as an old soldier of North-South cooperation. And it is this, that I do totally understand the sensitivities of unionism around cross-border interaction. The fears of the slippery slope, the Trojan horse, pulling away from the UK orbit. I know those fears are real, and we have to take them seriously. And I was very interested to hear what Joel had to say in the last panel, and well said, Joel, and well done. I suppose my point is that North-South cooperation doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. To me, history and geography mean that whatever the political and constitutional framework and context, whether today or in the future, both parts of this island and the two islands of Ireland and Britain are deeply intertwined and interconnected and will remain so. None of us are going anywhere. As such, there's an onus on those holding executive authority, be it in Dublin, London or Belfast, or indeed Cardiff or Edinburgh, to maximise the potential of all relationships for the benefit of all of the people. If I had a magic wand in regard to North-South cooperation, it would be that it gets disentangled from the constitutional and the political and be allowed full expression, so that the clear potential of working together across areas such as enterprise, jobs, tourism, healthcare, education, climate change, infrastructure, culture, community and voluntary, just to mention but a few, that can be mobilised to the maximum for the benefit of all of the people, and the same applies east, west. I suppose in saying all that, I've just declared myself a complete naive. I have learned nothing apparently. But just months before he died, Seamus Mallon published a memoir with a fine collaboration by Andy Pollock around his vision for the future, and it was entitled Shared Home Place. And in effect, that's exactly what I'm talking about in my closing plea. We all care deeply about this place, whether we're talking in Northern Ireland or an island context, this place that we call home. And I loved what Colin Davidson was saying about all of that today, again, with the power of the artist. His love for Belfast, because what is it? Belfast is home. And we have to find a way, as Seamus Mallon wrote about just towards the end of his life, we have to find a way to share this place. And in that regard, I will leave the last word to Seamus's great colleague and friend David Trimble, also now sadly no longer with us, when asked why, against the backdrop of such controversy around the issue historically, the North-South arrangements of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was seen to have bedded in successfully, and ultimately almost without controversy. He replied, because in this agreement, and I quote, we got the architecture right. So that's it, Anthony. Thank you for the kind invitation, and thank you all for listening to me. I know that was a bit of a, I don't know what I'll say to you on a Thursday afternoon in September. But look, I got the chance to do it, and I just want to try and capture it. And I suppose just to say to you guys now, next, I'm the old generation now moving on. The next generation coming in, the torch is over now to you. And I hope that what we did do, and as David Trimble said, that there's good architecture there, really actually underneath it all. And I hope you can build on that. And I want to take the opportunity wishing you all well in your work. You're all doing great work in your different sectors out there. You wouldn't be here today if you weren't, and I thank you for that. And a special thanks to the Centre for Cross-Border Studies for all it's doing and for bringing us together so well. Thank you all. Thanks.